In whatsoever mode, or by whatsoever means, our knowledge may relate to objects, it is at least quite clear that the only manner in which it immediately relates to them is by means of an intuition. To this, as the indispensable groundwork, all thought points. But an intuition can take place only in so far as the object is given to us. This, again, is only possible, to man at least, on condition that the object affect the mind in a certain manner. The capacity for receiving representations, receptivity, through the mode in which we are affected by objects, is called sensibility. By means of sensibility, therefore, objects are given to us, and it alone furnishes us with intuitions. By the understanding they are thought, and from it arise conceptions. But a thought must directly or indirectly, by means of certain signs, relate ultimately to intuitions, consequently, with us, to sensibility, because in no other way can an object be given to us. The effect of an object upon the faculty of representation, so far as we are affected by the said object, is sensation. That sort of intuition which relates to an object by means of sensation is called an empirical intuition. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is called phenomenon. That which in the phenomenon corresponds to the sensation, I term its matter. But that which affects that the content of the phenomenon can be arranged under certain relations, I call its form. But that in which our sensations are merely arranged, and by which they are susceptible of assuming a certain form, cannot be itself sensation. It is, then, the matter of all phenomena that is given to us a posteriori. The form must lie ready a priori for them in the mind, and consequently can be regarded separately from all sensation. I call all representations pure, in the transcendental meaning of the word, wherein nothing is met with that which belongs to sensation, and accordingly we find existing in the mind a priori the pure form of sensuous intuitions in general, in which all the manifold content of the phenomenal world is arranged and viewed under certain relations. This pure form of sensibility I shall call pure intuition. Thus, if I take away from our representation of a body all that the understanding thinks as belonging to it, as substance, force, divisibility, etc., and also whatever belongs to sensation, as impenetrability, hardness, colour, etc., yet there is still something left us from this empirical intuition, namely extension and shape. These belong to pure intuition, which exists a priori in the mind as a mere form of sensibility, and without any real object of the senses or any sensation. The science of all the principles of sensibility a priori I call transcendental aesthetic. The Germans are the only people who at present use this word to indicate what others call the critique of taste. At the foundation of this term lies the disappointed hope, which the eminent analyst Baumgarten conceived, of subjecting the criticism of the beautiful to principles of reason, and so of elevating its rules into a science. But his endeavours were vain, for the said rules of criteria are, in respect to their chief sources, merely empirical, consequently never can serve as determinate laws a priori, by which our judgment in matters of taste is to be directed. It is rather our judgment which forms the proper test as to the correctness of the principles. On this account it is advisable to give up the use of the term as designating the critique of taste, and apply it solely to that doctrine which is true science, the science of the laws of sensibility, and thus come nearer to the language and the sense of the ancients in their well-known division of the objects of cognition into aiotheta kai noeta, or to share with it speculative philosophy, and to employ it partly in a transcendental, partly in a psychological signification.
Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje, dank u Sinterklaasje. Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje. Dank u Sinterklaasje. Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje. Dank u Sinterklaasje. Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje. Dank u Sinterklaasje. Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje. Dank u Sinterklaasje. Sinterklaas kapoentje, gooi wat in mijn schoentje, gooi wat in mijn laarsje. Dank u Sinterklaasje.
There must, then, be such a science forming the first part of the transcendental doctrine of elements, in contradistinction to that part which contains the principles of pure thought, and which is called transcendental logic. In the science of transcendental aesthetic, accordingly, we shall first isolate sensibility, or the sensuous faculty, by separating from it all that is annexed to its perceptions by the conceptions of understanding, so that nothing be left but empirical intuition. In the next place, we shall take away from this intuition all that belongs to sensation, so that nothing may remain but pure intuition, and the mere form of phenomena, which is all that the sensibility can afford a priori. From this investigation it will be found that there are two pure forms of sensuous intuition as principles of knowledge a priori, namely space and time. To the consideration of these we shall now proceed. Metaphysical exposition of this conception. By means of the external sense, a property of the mind, we represent to ourselves objects as without us, and these all in space. Herein alone are their shape, dimensions, and relations to each other determined or determinable. The internal sense, by means of which the mind contemplates itself or its internal state, gives indeed no intuition of the soul as an object, yet there is nevertheless a determinate form under which alone the contemplation of our internal state is possible, so that all which relates to the inward determination of the mind is represented in relations of time. Of time we cannot have any external intuition, any more than we can have an internal intuition of space. What then are time and space? Are they real existences, or are they merely relations, or determinations of things, such, however, as would equally belong to these things in themselves, though they should never become objects of intuition, or are they such things as belong only to the form of intuition, and consequently to the subjective constitution of the mind, without which these predicates of time and space could not be attached to any object? In order to become informed on these points, we shall first give an exposition of the conception of space. By exposition, I mean the clear, though not detailed, representation of that which belongs to a conception. And an exposition is metaphysical when it contains that. Represents the conception as given a priori. 1. Space is not a conception which has been derived from outward experiences. For, in order that certain sensations may relate to something without me, that is, to something which occupies a different part of space from that in which I am, in like manner, in order that I may represent them not merely as without, of, and near to each other, but also in separate places, the representation of space must already exist as a foundation. Consequently, the representation of space cannot be borrowed from the relations of external phenomena through experience, but, on the contrary, this external experience is itself only possible through the said antecedent representation. 2. Space, then, is a necessary representation a priori, which serves for the foundation of all external intuitions. We never can imagine or make a representation to ourselves of the non-existence of space, though we may easily enough think that no objects are found in it. It must therefore be considered as the condition of the possibility of phenomena, and by no means as a determination dependent on them, and is a representation a priori, which necessarily supplies the basis for external phenomena. 3. Space is no discursive or, as we say, general conception of the relations of things, but a pure intuition. For in the first place, we can only represent to ourselves one space, and when we talk of diverse spaces, we mean only parts of one and the same space. Moreover, these parts cannot antecede this one all-embracing space as the component parts from which the aggregate can be made up, but can be cogitated only as existing in it. Space is essentially one, and multiplicity in it, consequently the general notion of spaces, of this or that space, depends solely upon limitations. Hence it follows that an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, lies at the root of all our conceptions of space. Thus, moreover, the principles of geometry, for example that, quote, in a triangle, two sides together are greater than the third, end quote, are never deduced from general conceptions of line and triangle, but from intuition, and this is a priori, with apodeictic certainty. Space is represented as an infinite given quantity. Now, every conception must indeed be considered as a representation which is contained in an infinite multitude of different possible representations, which, therefore, comprises these under itself. But no conception as such can be so conceived, as if it contained within itself an infinite multitude of representations. Nevertheless, space is so conceived of, for all parts of space are equally capable of being produced to infinity. Consequently, the original representation of space is an intuition a priori and not a conception. 3. Transcendental exposition of the conception of space. By a transcendental exposition, I mean the explanation of a conception as a principle, whence can be discerned the possibility of other synthetical a priori cognitions. For this purpose, it is requisite, firstly, that such cognitions do really flow from the given conception, and secondly, that the said cognitions are only possible under the presupposition of a given mode of explaining this conception. Geometry is a science which determines the properties of space synthetically, and yet a priori. What, then, must be our representation of space in order that such a cognition of it may be possible? It must be originally intuition. For from a mere conception no propositions can be deduced which go out beyond the conception, and yet this happens in geometry. But this intuition must be found in the mind a priori, that is, before any perception of objects. Consequently must be pure, not empirical intuition. For geometrical principles are always apodeictic, that is, united with the consciousness of their necessity as, quote, space has only 3 dimensions, end quote. But propositions of this kind cannot be empirical judgments, nor conclusions from them. Introduction Part 2. Now, how can an external intuition anterior to objects themselves, and in which our conception of objects can be determined a priori, exist in the human mind? Obviously, not otherwise than in so far as it has its seat in the subject only, as the formal capacity of the subjects being affected by objects, and thereby of obtaining immediate representation, that is, intuition, consequently only as the form of the external sense in general. Thus it is only by means of our explanation that the possibility of geometry, as a synthetical science a priori, becomes comprehensible. Every mode of explanation which does not show us this possibility, although in appearance it may be similar to ours, can with the utmost certainty be distinguished from it by these marks. Space does not represent any property of objects as things in themselves, nor does it represent them in their relations to each other. In other words, space does not represent to us any determination of objects such as attaches to the objects themselves and would remain even though all subjective conditions of the intuition were abstracted. For neither absolute nor relative determinations of objects can be intuited prior to the existence of the things to which they belong, and therefore not a priori. Space is nothing else than the form of all phenomena of the external sense, that is, the subjective condition of the sensibility under which alone external intuition is possible. Now, because the receptivity or capacity of the subject to be affected by objects necessarily antecedes all intuitions of these objects, it is easily understood how the form of all phenomena can be given to the mind previous to all actual perceptions, therefore a priori, and how it, as a pure intuition, in which all objects must be determined, can contain principles of the relations of these objects prior to all experience. It is therefore from the human point of view only that we can speak of space, extended objects, etc. If we depart from the subjective condition under which alone we can obtain external intuition, or, in other words, by means of which we are affected by objects, the representation of space has no meaning whatsoever. This predicate is only applicable to things in so far as they appear to us, that is, are objects of sensibility. The constant form of this receptivity, which we call sensibility, is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects can be intuited as existing without us, and when abstraction of these objects is made, is a pure intuition, to which we give the name of space. It is clear that we cannot make the special conditions of sensibility into conditions of the possibility of things, but only of the possibility of their existence as far as they are phenomena. And so we may correctly say that space contains all which can appear to us externally, but not all things considered as things in themselves, be they intuited or not, or by whatsoever subject one will. As to the intuitions of other thinking beings, we cannot judge whether they are or are not bound by the same conditions which limit our own intuition, and which for us are universally valid. If we join the limitation of a judgment to the conception of the subject, then the judgment will possess unconditioned validity. For example, the proposition, quote, all objects are beside each other in space, end quote, is valid only under the limitation that these things are taken as objects of our sensuous intuition. But if I join the condition to the conception and say, quote, all things as external phenomena are beside each other in space, end quote, then the rule is valid universally and without any limitation. Our expositions, consequently, teach the reality, i.e. the objective validity, of space in regard of all which can be presented to us externally as object, and at the same time also the ideality of space in regard to objects when they are considered by means of reason as things in themselves.
Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society, by giving a certain direction to public opinion and a certain tenor to the laws, by imparting new maxims to the governing powers and peculiar habits to the governed. I speedily perceived that the influence of this fact extends far beyond the political character and the laws of the country, and that it has no less empire over civil society than over the government. It creates opinions, engenders sentiments, suggests the ordinary practices of life, and modifies whatever it does not produce. The more I advanced in the study of American society, the more I perceived that the equality of conditions is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived, and the central point at which all my observations constantly terminated. I then turned my thoughts to our own hemisphere, where I imagined that I discerned something analogous to the spectacle which the New World presented to me.
Come, said my soul, such verses for my body let us write, for we are one, that should I after return, or long, long hence in other spheres, there to some group of mates the chance resuming, tallying earth's soil, trees, winds, tumultuous waves, ever with pleased smile I may keep on, ever and ever yet the verses owning, as, first, I here and now, signing for soul and body, set to them my name. One's self I sing. One's self I sing, a simple, separate person. Yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. A physiology from top to toe I sing. Not physiognomy alone, nor brain alone is worthy for the muse. I say the form complete is worthier far. The female equally with the male I sing. Of life immense in passion, pulse, and power. Cheerful, for freest action formed under the laws divine. The modern man I sing.
I observed that the equality of conditions is daily progressing towards those extreme limits which it seems to have reached in the United States, and that the democracy which governs the American communities appears to be rapidly rising into power in Europe. It is evident to all alike that a great democratic revolution is going on amongst us, but there are two opinions as to its nature and consequences. To some it appears to be a novel accident, which as such may still be checked. To others it seems irresistible, because it is the most uniform, the most ancient, and the most permanent tendency which is to be found in history. Let us recollect the situation of France 700 years ago, when the territory was divided amongst a small number of families, who were the owners of the soil and the rulers of the inhabitants.
Walt Whitman.
The right of governing descended with the family inheritance from generation to generation. Force was the only means by which man could act on man, and landed property was the sole source of power. Soon, however, the political power of the clergy was founded, and began to exert itself. The clergy opened its ranks to all classes, to the poor and the rich, the villain and the lord. Equality penetrated into the government through the church, and the being who as a serf must have vegetated in perpetual bondage took his place as a priest in the midst of nobles, and not infrequently above the heads of kings. The different relations of men became more intimate and more numerous as society gradually
As I
became more
pondered in
stable and more
silence,
civilized. Thence the want of civil laws was felt, and the order of legal functionaries soon rose from the obscurity of the tribunals and their dusty chambers to appear at the court of the monarch, by the side of the feudal barons in their ermine and their mail. Whilst the kings were ruining themselves by their great enterprises, and the nobles exhausting their resources by private wars, the lower orders were enriching themselves by commerce.
as I pondered in silence, returning upon my poems, considering, lingering long, a phantom arose before me with distrustful aspect, terrible in beauty, age, and power, the genius of poets of old lands, as to me directing like flame its eyes, with finger pointing to many immortal songs, and menacing voice. What singest thou? It said. Knowest thou not there is but one theme for ever enduring bards? And that is the theme of war, the fortune of battles, the making of perfect soldiers. Be it so, then, I answered. I too, haughty shade, also sing war, and a longer and greater one than any, waged in my book, with varying fortune, with flight, advance and retreat, victory deferred and wavering, yet methinks certain, or as good as certain at the last, the field the world, for life and death, for the body and for the eternal soul. Lo, I too am come, chanting the chant of
Began
battles.
in its turn to confer influence and power, every improvement which was introduced in commerce or manufacture was a fresh element of the equality of conditions. Henceforward, every new discovery, every new want which it engendered, and every new desire which craved satisfaction, was a step towards the universal level. The taste for luxury, the love of war, the sway of fashion, and the most superficial as well as the deepest passions of the human heart co-operated to enrich the poor and to impoverish the rich. From the time when the exercise of the intellect became the source of strength and of wealth, it is impossible not to consider every addition to science, every fresh truth, and every new idea as a germ of power placed within the reach of the people. Poetry, eloquence, and memory, the grace of wit, the glow of imagination, the depth of thought, and all the gifts which are bestowed by Providence with an equal hand, turned to the advantage of the democracy; and even when they were in the possession of its adversaries, they still served its cause by throwing into relief the natural greatness of man. Its conquests spread, therefore, with those of civilization and knowledge, and literature became an arsenal where the poorest and the weakest could always find weapons to their hand. In perusing the pages of our history, we shall scarcely meet with a single great event in the lapse of 700 years which has not turned to the advantage of equality. The Crusades and the wars of the English decimated the nobles and divided their possessions. The erection of communities introduced an element of democratic liberty into the bosom of feudal monarchy. The invention of firearms equalized the villain and the noble on the field of battle. Printing opened the same resources to the minds of all classes. The post was organized so as to bring the same information to the door of the poor man's cottage and to the gate of the palace. And Protestantism proclaimed that all men are alike able to find discovery of America offered 1,000 new paths to fortune and placed riches and power within the reach of the adventurous and the obscure. If we examine what has happened in France at intervals of 50 years, beginning with the 11th century, we shall invariably perceive that a twofold revolution has taken place in the state of society. The noble has gone down on the social ladder, and the roturier has gone up. The one descends as the other rises. Every half-century brings them nearer to each other, and they will very shortly meet. Nor is this phenomenon at all peculiar to France. Whithersoever we turn our eyes, we shall witness the same continual revolution throughout the whole of Christendom. The various occurrences of national existence have everywhere turned to the advantage of democracy. All men have aided it by their exertions. Those who have intentionally labored in its cause, and those who have served it unwittingly. Those who have fought for it, and those who have declared themselves its opponents, have all been driven along in the same track, have all labored to one end, some ignorantly and some unwillingly. All have been blind instruments in the hands of God. The gradual development of the equality of conditions is therefore a providential fact, and it possesses all the characteristics of a divine decree. It is universal, it is durable, it constantly eludes all human interference, and all events as well as all men contribute to its progress. Would it then be wise to imagine that a social impulse which dates from so far back can be checked by the efforts of a generation? Is it credible that the democracy which has annihilated the feudal system and vanquished kings will respect the citizen and the capitalist? Will it stop now that it has grown so strong and its adversaries so weak? None can say which way we are going, for all terms of comparison are wanting. The equality of conditions is more complete in the Christian countries of the present day than it has been at any time or in any part of the world, so that the extent of what already exists prevents us from foreseeing what may be yet to come. The whole book which is here offered to the public has been written under the impression of a kind of religious dread produced in the author's mind by the contemplation of so irresistible a revolution, which has advanced for centuries in spite of such amazing obstacles, and which is still proceeding in the midst of the ruins it has made. It is not necessary that God himself should speak in order to disclose to us the unquestionable signs of his will. We can discern them in the habitual course of nature, and in the invariable tendency of events. I know, without a special revelation, that the planets move in the orbits traced by the Creator's fingers. If the men of our time were led by attentive observation and by sincere reflection to acknowledge that the gradual and progressive development of social equality is at once the past and future of their history, this solitary truth would confer the sacred character of a divine decree upon the change. To attempt to check democracy would be in that case to resist the will of God, and the nations would then be constrained to make the best of the social lot awarded to them by Providence. The Christian nations of our age seem to me to present a most alarming spectacle. The impulse which is bearing them along is so strong that it cannot be stopped, but it is not yet so rapid that it cannot be guided. Their fate is in their hands, yet a little while and it may be so no longer. The first duty which is at this time imposed upon those who direct our affairs is to educate the democracy, to warm its faith, if that be possible, to purify its morals, to direct its energies, to substitute a knowledge of business for its inexperience, and an acquaintance with its true interests for its blind propensities, to adapt its government to time and place, and to modify it in compliance with the occurrences and the actors of the age. A new science of politics is indispensable to a new world. This, however, is what we think of least. Launched in the middle of a rapid stream, we obstinately fix our eyes on the ruins which may still be described upon the shore we have left, whilst the current sweeps us along and drives us backwards towards the gulf.
I, above all, promote brave soldiers. In cabined ships at sea, the boundless blue on every side expanding, with whistling winds and music of the waves, the large imperious waves, or some lone bark buoyed on the dense marine. where joyous full of faith, spreading white sails, she cleaves the ether mid the sparkle and the foam of day, or under many a star at night. By sailors, young and old, haply will I, a reminiscence of the land, be read, in full rapport at last. Here are our thoughts, voyagers' thoughts. Here not the land, firm land, alone appears, may then by them be said, the sky o'erarches here. We feel the undulating deck beneath our feet. We feel the long pulsation, ebb and flow of endless motion, the tones of unseen mystery, the vague and vast suggestions of the briny world, the liquid flowing syllables, the perfume, the faint creaking of the cordage, the melancholy rhythm, the boundless vista and the horizon far and dim are all here, and this is ocean's poem. Then falter not, O book, fulfill your destiny, you not a reminiscence of the land alone, you too as a lone bark cleaving the ether, purposed I know not whither, yet ever full of faith, consort to every ship that sails, sail you, bear forth to them folded my love. Dear mariners, for you I fold it here in every leaf. Speed on, my book, spread your white sails, my little bark athwart the imperious waves. Chant on, sail on, bear o'er the boundless blue from me to every sea, this song for mariners and all their ships.
In no country in Europe has the great social revolution which I have been describing made such rapid progress as in France, but it has always been borne on by chance. The heads of the state have never had any forethought for its exigencies, and its victories have been obtained without their consent or without their knowledge. The most powerful, the most intelligent, and the most moral classes of the nation have never attempted to connect themselves with it in order to guide it. The people has consequently been abandoned to its wild propensities, and it has grown up like those outcasts who receive their education in the public streets, and who are unacquainted with aught but the vices and wretchedness of society. The existence of a democracy was seemingly unknown, when on a sudden it took possession of the supreme power. Everything was then submitted to its caprices. It was worshipped as the idol of strength, until, when it was enfeebled by its own excesses, the legislator conceived the rash project of annihilating its power, instead of instructing it and correcting its vices. No attempt was made to fit it to govern, but all were bent on excluding it from the government. The consequence of this has been that the democratic revolution has been effected only in the material parts of society, without that concomitant change in laws, ideas, customs, and manners which was necessary to render such a revolution beneficial. We have gotten a democracy, but without the conditions which lessen its vices and render its natural advantages more prominent, and although we already perceive the evils it brings, we are ignorant of the benefits it may confer.
Sweet idea, deathless throughout the ages, races, lands, after a strange, sad war, great war for thee. I think all war through time was really fought, and ever will be really fought, for thee.
Character which he enjoyed
These
in the eyes of the
chants
multitude
for thee,
derived a motive
the
for the just
eternal
use
march
of his power from the
of
respect
thee.
which he inspired. only of those whose welfare Providence had entrusted to their care. The people never having conceived the idea of a social condition different from its own, and entertaining no expectation of ever ranking with its chiefs, received benefits from them without discussing their rights. It grew attached to them when they were clement and just, and it submitted without resistance or civility to their exactions as to the inevitable visitations of the arm of God. Custom and the manners of the time had moreover created a species of law in the midst of violence, and established certain limits to oppression. As the noble never suspected that any one would attempt to deprive him of the privileges which he believed to be legitimate, and as the serf looked upon his own inferiority as a consequence of the immutable order of nature, it is easy to imagine that a mutual exchange of goodwill took place between two classes so differently divided.
It is not my intention to detain the reader by expatiating on the variety or the importance of the subject, which I have undertaken to
Froh, froh, wie seine Sonnen fliegen rum, wie seine Sonnen fliegen durch des Himmels prächt'ge Bahn. Laufet, Brüder, eure Bahn, laufet, Brüder, eure Bahn, freudig, wie ein Held zum Siegen, wie ein Held zum Siegen. Laufet, Brüder, eure Bahn, laufet, Brüder, eure Bahn, freudig, wie ein Held zum Siegen, wie ein Held zum Siegen.
Sometimes I go looking in the meadow and in the trees, wherever I go looking, you go too. And I used to run away from all my sins that I have done. I used to run into the night. All my sins, they hid the light.
Our first high school days may be traced from the age of Trajan and the Antonines, when the Roman monarchy, having attained its full strength and maturity, began to verge toward its decline, and will extend to the subversion of the Western Empire by the barbarians of Germany and Scythia, Roman ancestors of the most British nations of Europe.
Wish we were eidolons. Lo, I or you, or woman, man, or state, known or unknown, we seeming solid wealth, strength, beauty build, but really build eidolons. Haven studies long, or warriors, martyrs, heroes' toils, to fashion his eidolon.
Constantinople, and the elevation of Charlemagne, who in the year 800 established the Second or German Empire of the West. The last and longest of its periods spans about 6 centuries. An author easily persuades himself that the book is still faithful to its letters, and I have now increased the
I go wandering
design and of the Roman
to the water and through the weeds.
computes that 3 ponderous volumes have already
Wherever
may perhaps be alarmed at the long loss of but it is not my intention to expatiate on the same
I go wandering,
at our entrance into this book.
you go
Beyond the chemist and his chemistry,
I used to run
of entities, eidolons,
away from
fixed, ever shall be, ever have been, and are, sweeping the present to the infinite future. Eidolons, eidolons, eidolons.
Preface to the first volume. Diligence and accuracy are the only merits to which an historical writer may ascribe to himself. If any merit indeed can be assumed from the performance
Eidolons, eidolons.
I used to ride into